Hello guys. All right, so we're gonna move on a little bit from energy, and we're gonna actually get into our last unit. And that's gonna be on different forms of pollution. Okay, so different forms of pollution, which is actually really cool. So we're gonna break it up into water pollution, air pollution, and ground pollution. Okay, so that's super exciting. And then if there's some time, we might talk a little bit about climate change at the very end. So we will see. So we're going to start with a little bit about water pollution. Whoop, whoop. All right, so let's do some recap on water. We talked a little bit about water with when we did our biogeochemical cycles, if we remember. And we know that water is essential for all life on Earth, for humans and for any other organisms. We can only go about a few days, like 2 to 3, without. There are two major types of water found on Earth. That's going to be fresh water and salt water. We know that we have much more salt water available to us than we do fresh water. So 71% of the Earth's surface we know is covered with water, right? 97% of Earth's water is salt water. So that's the water that we can't really use by itself. And then we know that 77% of fresh water is found in glaciers. So we know that the reason why climate change is so important is because we're losing those glaciers. We're losing our source of fresh water, right? And we cannot drink salt water. That would be a problem. So that was just a tiny recap on some things that we had definitely talked about before on water. This should look maybe familiar. This is our water cycle, right? We talked about our major parts of precipitation, which is water coming from the sky down, evaporation, water from the ground coming up, transpiration, which is just like evaporation but from trees. We talked about surface runoff, when water comes down and runs off of things like the ground into things like lakes and rivers. We even talked about groundwater flow, when water is absorbed into the ground and then it ends up into major waterways like the ocean or a river. Right, so just again, quick recap, we've talked about this before. So there's a lot of different categories of like water pollution. What is actually being dumped in water or leaked into water, and we kind of categorize them in different ways. So we have things like infectious agents, things like bacteria, worms, viruses, right? Those can also be naturally occurring. So not all pollution in the water is because of us, surprising. Some of it is more naturally. So things like organic or versus inorganic chemicals. So inorganic chemicals like metals, acids, and salts. Salt can be found, in different bodies of water like the ocean, which can contaminate fresh water, right? That can happen in a variety of different ways. It doesn't always have to be by a person. Plant nutrients. That's a big one, because if you have a farm area and they're using a lot of these fertilizers have a lot of nitrates in them, a lot of phosphate, and if a lot of that ends up running off into the ocean, it's actually not really good, right? We've kind of talked a little bit about what that can end up doing. So you also have things like organic chemicals, like oily and gasoline plastics, things that are a little bit more on the man-made side that end up polluting waterways. It's not good. Radioactive materials, right? That could be very bad, ending up kind of causing like a radioactive reaction with anything that happens to be in the water. So this is just to show you a lot can be considered water pollution. Oop, nope, we're not gonna go. There we go. All right, lake pollution. So lakes are more vulnerable to pollutants than streams, because lakes is just this one trapped body of water, right? So there's not any flowing water too many times with lakes, which then means it's easier to pollute them. All right, so what happens is, if a lot of nutrients from farms or from using fertilizers, anyone, like if someone has a giant garden nearby and it rains one night and all of these pollutants end up in these lakes, it can actually cause a lot of problems. So this picture you see on this slide is of a lake, right? The lake is green. It is green because it has a lot of algae sitting at the top. We talked about algae blooms before. So algae blooms are very, very dangerous. And because of all this high nitrate and phosphates in the water, a lot of algae can grow. And we know that since the algae kind of take control of the top or the surface of the water, plants underneath can't grow, animals are going to not be able to live in that lake, so it can cause lots of problems. So lakes are affected a lot. There are actual people's jobs where they are in charge of taking care of lakes, making sure that any man-made or natural lake has the appropriate plants, has the appropriate levels of certain types of compounds like phosphates or nitrogen to make sure that everything's going to go okay. The water under the ground can also become polluted, right? It's called groundwater pollution. So what could happen is if something is decomposing or there is like tainted water and it's absorbed into the ground, it could end up in our reservoirs of underground water, right? So what can happen is if something is decomposing, it can leak that bacteria down into that water. And as we know, some people have things like well water, and that might end up in places like that. So groundwater pollution is a little less likely, but still happens. And what can end up happening is there is something called a lower dissolved oxygen count. You don't have to worry too much about what that means. It just means that things get built up a lot underground, and it makes it difficult for the water to become purified, and it makes it more difficult to like use that water. This is just a picture kind of just showing you like pollution, what different things could happen with the pollution, what would happen with underneath with all of these underground reservoirs of water. They're called aquifers, but just showing what can happen. This one is then just showing the same, but like with the ocean, right? So a big thing too is dumping. A lot of industries dump their unnecessary waste or materials into a body of water, which can cause a lot of problems. So these are just giving you some ideas of what's actually happening. All right, but one of the biggest things we know about water pollution are spills in the ocean, right? Oil spills, probably one of the worst things to happen, right? Look at these poor sad birds, sad. So one of the biggest ones that ended up happening was when the Deepwater Horizon drill and pipeline kind of ended up exploding on April 20th, 2010. That seems like a very far away date. That's like 10 years ago. But it's still having effects, which is why it's really crazy and scary how much oil spills can really affect water, right? So Deepwater Horizon exploded. This rig was pumping up oil, right, from underground oil reserves under the water. And the oil leaked out of this pipe because the pipe was damaged under the water for 87 days nonstop. So for 87 days, all of that oil leaked into the Gulf of Mexico. Gross, really gross and very difficult. It's very difficult to clean up oil in water, right? So what does that actually look like, right? I could say it's leaking in there for 87 days, but what does that mean? Well, let's look at this pool right here. Look, everyone having fun in this pool. Woo, great. Well, 160 of these pools filled of oil leaked into the Gulf of Mexico each day for 87 days. So think about that pool. Think about it filled with oil. 160 of them per day. Right, that's a total of 800,000 gallons of oil per day. That was every day for that 87 days. So in total, it leaked an estimated 94 million to 184 million gallons of oil. That is crazy. And that is the equivalent of 35,000 swimming pools. So 35,000 swimming pools worth of oil was dumped into the Gulf of Mexico. That is gross. So this is where it's showing you where the leak was, right? So this is where the Deepwater Horizon was, the rig, and where it exploded. And this is kind of showing you the radius of where all of the oil was. Now, looking at this map, you're like, okay, well, that's a small area. It is not. It's a very large area. And look at all of these points here. All these boxes are actually showing you major cities that were extremely affected because of the oil. Right? Because of oil spills, it's killing the fish, it's killing the birds, it's making it difficult for plants to live and survive. That water source can't be used by anything. And if you know anything about oil and water, they don't mix, right? If I were to ask you to go into your kitchen and take a cup of vegetable oil and dump it into a glass of water, you would see it separates. But then if I asked you to separate just the oil, just get the oil back out of the water, it would be very, very difficult. It would be hard. Actually, I challenge you, go try. So, what we try and do to prevent a lot of these issues from happening, right? We're trying to prevent people from dumping, trying to prevent, just unnecessary waste in our water. We came up with the Clean Water Act. This was started in 1972. It helps to regulate pollution that's discharged into waters of the United States. It made it unlawful for any person to discharge any pollutant into a body of water. All right, so you could not put anything into water. Like, I can't go outside and just dump whatever I want into a body of water. I can get very much in trouble, a huge fine, possibly go to jail for a little while. There's also the Water Quality Act, which was introduced earlier in 1965, which requires states to issue water quality standards for our interstate waters, meaning that the state of New Jersey has to provide you clean drinking water. You have to have some kind of access to that water, because you can't just go to the faucet and be like, oh, well, it's turned the color brown, I guess we'll just drink it anyway. That's bad. There could be all types of different materials in there, so the state has to provide you with clean drinking water, because again, remember, we need that to survive. Now, if you remember back in 2014, again, yes, I know it feels like a long time ago, one state had a huge issue, a very, very large issue with getting clean drinking water, Flint, Michigan. So Flint, Michigan had a water crisis that began in 2014. It only just recently ended. So it took them almost about, 5 years to really get on the ball with this. Flint residents were unknowingly for a little while drinking toxic water. They had lead in their water, which actually can lead to things like lead poisoning, aggression, learning problems, irritation. People could die from lead poisoning, and they were drinking that, right? People were actually able to set their water on fire, which is kind of cool, but really scary. So for our Water Quality Act, that's what that's in place for, is to prevent things like this, right? So we're going to actually look at an article or two on Flint, Michigan, just to learn again what actually happened and why things kind of went a little wrong, okay? So there is a little bit more to this PowerPoint, but I'm going to stop us here, because this is pretty much the overall what we need to know for water pollution. I'm going to just skip us to the very last stage right here, which is just what we can do and what we can, some solutions to keeping water pollution down to a minimum, right? Like, try to make sure that if you're using things like pesticides or using things like fertilizers, that you're not using a ton, because that can end up back in the ground or in some type of water source. Make sure that you are treating anything if you're working with sewage, though none of you should be. Practice the 4 R's always, which is reuse, reduce, recycle, and then reduce resources of waste, help to reduce just using too much materials in general, right? Things you can do, buying organic foods, because organic foods won't really poison anything, right? It'll just kind of decomp in the ground by itself. Compost your foods. We'll actually look at composting when we talk about ground pollution. I'm actually working on maybe building my own compost soon. A big one that I kind of want to bring up is this bottom one here, which is interesting with the little time that I have left. Do not flush unwanted medicines down the toilet. A lot of times people like to flush random things down toilets, and it seems funny and fun, but that water gets recycled, and that chemical can end back in a water source. So you can't just dump whatever you want down a toilet. It might seem like you can. It might seem like a good idea, but please do not flush anything that is not normally going down the toilet. All right. Okay, cool, guys. All right, so there's going to be a Google Classroom question, right? Post separately from this video. I'm trying to keep the questions and the videos separate, just so that way you can always reference this without going back to the question. And it's going to be about the PowerPoint. All right, thank you so much. Have a wonderful Tuesday. All right, bye, guys.